Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the October webinar series on the lesson learned events that we do with active assailant assaults that have taken place in the past, where we kind of jump in, find out some of the details of the events, as well as try to figure out, what lessons that we can learn from them. How can we learn the lessons, apply them with our entities moving forward to make our establishments a little bit safer, or to hopefully help prevent attacks in the future, or as well, of course, be better prepared in the sense of actions in the moments if we're forced to do so. Well, in today's webinar, we're going to be jumping into the 2019 shooting that took place at a STEM school in Highlands Ranch, Colorado. I'll jump into the details in that in just here in a couple of minutes. But with Defender School, I started it just here a couple of years ago, but I've been providing active shooter response training since, I think, dating back into 2012 and through various avenues with helping educators or helping houses of worship be better prepared for these types of, events. But we are happy to establish partnerships with educational facilities, houses of worship, medical facilities, just places of business in general, where we want to be able to empower you, to empower your staff or volunteers to be better prepared for the worst case of these types of situations. But we'll go ahead and move forward and jump into a couple of fundamental definitions here this morning. Go ahead and fix this camera real quick. There we go, get myself out of the way there. But the chart that you're looking at is active shooter events that have taken place from the year of 2001 up to 2022. And if you've been on our webinars in the past, you've seen me post this chart. It obviously is trending up and has been for several years. But at the same time, we need to understand that it's not something that happens every day of our lives, right? And that comes down to, how we look, or how the FBI looks at what a true active killer of active shooter event is. And ultimately the FBI defines these active shooter events as one or more persons that is actively engaging in trying to, shoot or injure or kill, people in typically with populated areas. This, it's important that we draw a line difference between your typical, violent crime that, may involve, gangs or drug dealers or, just criminals in general, where potentially they use guns to hurt other people. But when we're talking about the active shooter situation, the FBI draws a distinction between, the gang violence that took place down the street versus the person who's willing to go into a school with intentions on harming, sometimes random people. And there's a very strong difference between that. Most of the time the shooters will lack empathy and see no problem at all, with causing harms to, to other individuals, where even your gang violence down the street, even that gang attacker who kills that innocent person may have remorse, may have regrets. Well, a lot of times these active shooters, they don't have remorse, they don't have regrets, they lack empathy in general. And we'll see that in this shooting, I believe that it also holds some of those characteristics, as well as, potentially takes on a couple of more. As we move forward and jump into the details, if you have questions, be sure to, as we're dropping them through, or as we're going through, to drop them in the Q&A section down at the bottom. I'll do my best to pay attention to that and make sure that we get those answered before, the end of the show. It's also important that we don't provide notoriety, to the shooters, to the attackers. And I always do my best to avoid using their names, to avoid showing their faces. And everybody that pays attention to this kind of stuff and studies this kind of stuff all agrees on the fact that we should not be providing them any notoriety. because sometimes it is the fame and notoriety that is a strong motivator behind these attacks. And so if we stop giving them that attention, then at least at the very least, there'd be less copycat crimes, as we go through it. So I'll kind of join in the "Don't Name Them" campaign, with that, as we jump into these details. The STEM school that we're talking about today sits in Highland Ranch, Colorado. Now, Highland Ranch is a suburb just south of the Denver area, as you can see on the map. The school was a charter school, K through 12. It has about 850 students that would have been enrolled or potentially attending on the day of, the attack. They did not have a traditional school resource officer at the time. There was a kind of a dispute that had taken place between the local sheriff and the school over the responsibilities of the school resource officer. This may have been the first year or the second year or something like that where they did away with the SRO program. And so at the time they had a private security guard. Now, the private security guard was in law enforcement at one time, served as a jailer at one time. I believe he was a Marine, and had multiple or two deployments into the Afghanistan area, prior to this. And so this is not, someone who just got an armed security guard certification, just prior to this, or a security guard certification. He is definitely someone who had, that fit the role well and had training leading up to it. And I mentioned armed security guard certification, but very specifically, the school had intentionally hired an unarmed security guard, where they did not, I guess, want the presence or the image, of having to have the firearm on the property itself. And so they had requested an unarmed security guard. With that said, this security guard was actually carrying a gun on this day. And so I'm assuming that it must have been concealed, from the others. I don't know if you can see on the map, but I've got some blue dots on the map. And I think my body's actually covering up one of them in that southern west corner as well. And what those dots are, they actually represent, other major incidents that would fall under the category of active shooter incidents according to the FBI. And, and this isn't like this, all over the country, but in the Denver and Colorado Springs area, there's been several over, the past 20 years. Of course, Columbine, took place literally 15 minutes down the road, from the STEM school that we're going to talk about today. Just a couple of months ago, we talked about a shooting that started in Arvada, Colorado, just north of Denver. And the secondary location was a church down in Colorado Springs, which is about an hour south. There's the shooting that took place in Boulder here in the past couple of years. The Aurora movie theater shooting that took place in 2012. So there's been several, higher profile shootings that have taken place, but this is one of the more unique areas in the country where there doesn't traditionally seem to be a lot, very close together. But this community has definitely suffered from it over the years. And part of that suffering is a lot of the schools and the school systems have done more to be able to beef up against these active killer attacks. And it wasn't any different from the STEM school here. You had to be buzzed in. I believe one of the entrances had metal detectors. They had been known, at least at one of the entrances, to search different bags and cases and that kind of stuff coming into it. There were magnetic lock systems in place on the classrooms. There was communication devices that were designed to be able to push a button and immediately announce different threats throughout the school so people could begin to prepare faster. There was a direct communication channel between the sheriff department and the school. And so literally, not having to even go through 911 or go through any sort of extra steps. They're able to communicate directly with the sheriff's office in the event of a worst case situation like an active shooter event. And so, this area is definitely better prepared, than a lot of communities around the United States. And in this shooting, one person was killed and there were 8 people who were injured. The one person that was killed was actually, one of the heroes to this situation. Jump slides. Kendrick Costello. Kendrick Costello was killed in the attack. I'm going to talk about his situation here in a couple of minutes. But as I mentioned, he definitely died as a hero. He died saving the lives of other people. And unfortunately, he died. But thankfully, there were no other fatalities in this shooting incident. And so he ended up being the only fatality here. As we jump in and talk about the shooters, it was 2 shooters. Now this is very rare for active assailant attackers. Most of the time, it's one attacker with very, very few exceptions. Off the top of my head, you can think about Columbine, where they joined forces. I can think about another one in San Bernardino that was more terrorism related. And so, different motivations, but it's definitely the exception when you have 2 people that come together and work together in something like a school shooting, because now you're talking about, 2 individuals with major mental health issues that don't have problems and harming, multiple people. And so it wasn't any difference here. These 2 shooters spent several weeks planning the attack. And so I've got the graph up, and this is from the FBI data a few years ago. But most shooters end up spending about 1 to 2 months planning the attack. They probably fell in about that 1-month category. And so both of them were students at the school. One of them was 18 years old, an older male, and another one was a minor 16-year-old female. But identified, as a male, and that ended up being, some of the transgressions that other students had, with her and with her transgender formations ended up being, part of her motivations for going back as a school as a shooter. But they ultimately, like I said, they spent about a few weeks to a month planning this attack. With the shooters, both suspects had prior mental health issues. They were known to self-medicate and abuse drugs, both illicit drugs as well as prescription drugs. They would smoke marijuana. I think at least one of them had a prescription for Xanax. One of the shooters, the younger shooter, she was hospitalized in the years leading up to the shooting after consuming Xanax and alcohol ultimately together. Had to be hospitalized over that. But they also both suffered with cocaine addictions. And some of their friends thought that they were clean leading up to the attack. At least one friend was fully aware that they had relapsed. But they were definitely both doing cocaine leading up to the attack. There was a video, where they had even filmed with cocaine, down on a plate with one of them snorting it prior to the shooting taking place. But they definitely both had their issues kind of leading up to it. The number one shooter, ultimately had a fantasy. That fantasy was wanting to get away with murder. Through Snapchat conversations, about a month prior to the shooting, one of them kind of asked the other, what's the most twisted thing that you have on your bucket list? I believe the younger shooter, the most twisted thing that person had is they wanted to experiment with acid or something like that. But the older shooter, that person, talked about wanting to throw a party at a cabin and wanted to kill everybody who was there. And, and it went from that fantasy to ultimately the shooter ended up wanting to carry out the attack at the school instead. but he had a fantasy, wanting to get away with murder. And specifically, he ended up choosing the classroom because the classroom 107, at the STEM school contained the most amount of people that he hated. And so he was definitely choosing that classroom, that school for reasons. But this kind of all goes back to, a fantasy that he's probably had long before, carrying out this attack. And so they potentially planned it over a month, but and we don't know the answer to this, but he may have already have the older shooter may have already been planning or have been thinking about this for a much longer than what the situation shows with the evidence. This is a social media post by one of the attackers where he quotes the Bible in Deuteronomy, but he clearly has issues with Christians who quote hates gays, and probably sees a lot of hypocrisy there, in the fact that Christians potentially only pulling out the gays part of the section and quoting his words there. The younger shooter did have a history of personal trauma in her life. She had had things that happened at different times. Not sure what those were because they were unable to be released or did not come out through the investigation. Again, she was a minor, so a lot of that kind of stuff was, completely sealed. Her father had been deported after a domestic violence conviction that involved her mother. And so dad was out of the life for the most part for the years leading up to the shooting. There were some visitations, I think, down in Mexico to see him, but for the most part, he wasn't there for her, day-to-day life. I mentioned that genetically she was a female, but identified as a male. And many of the transgressions that were present over, from some of the students, some of the other students had stemmed from their unaccepting of her, being transgender. She had a history of self-cutting and self-harming. Some cuts that were so deep, highly likely really should have had stitches, but she was afraid to tell her mom, afraid to tell the hospital or anyone to be able to get help because she did not want to be labeled as somebody that did that, because she knew that she would likely end up being placed in some sort of a mental institution, at least temporarily. But some of the cuts were so deep that she had struggled to even get them to stop bleeding, at different points. One of her friends recounted an incident where he had received a call about her needing help with one of the cuts, helped bandage it up and whatnot, but they kept having to change out the bandages. He recounted that it had taken, I think, 2 days to be able to get that one cut to actually stop bleeding. She was committed into a hospital on a mental health hold at one point. She had been hospitalized twice in prior years, once for mixing the Xanax and alcohol that I mentioned previously, and once on that mental health hold for cutting herself. The number two shooter also had a history of hearing voices and suffered from homicidal and suicidal thoughts since the age of 12. Now, the homicidal piece there, that didn't come out until after the shooting took place, as far as my research was able to come up with. The person had claimed about suicidal thoughts at different points, but I don't think the homicidal tendencies or homicidal thoughts came out until afterward. She once heard voices telling her to cut her arm off with a meat slicer, at the establishment that she worked at. One of the shooters wrote "The Voices Win" on the wall of the older shooter's home. And so they went to that home to retrieve guns, among other things, prior to the actual shooting. I'll talk about that in a minute. But on one of the walls in there, they wrote "The Voices Win." Now, I say one of them wrote it. Originally, the younger shooter said that she wrote it when they were there, but during the testimony and the trial later on for the older shooter, she testified against him. She stated that he wrote it, and I'll get more into that here in a couple of minutes. But what was their motive? I've kind of mentioned already leading up to this that really both of them felt wronged by people in that classroom. I mentioned that the older shooter already stated that most of the people he hated were inside of that room. And, the younger female student had been bullied over her identifying as a male by a couple of the kids, in that classroom. She had been traumatized, and she wanted others to ultimately, to feel her pain that she was going through. Uh, there wasn't a lot of information where I could have said that, or anybody could have said that this could have been prevented necessarily on the front end. There were very small cues that were more obvious in hindsight than anything, but probably one of the biggest cues that has come up was that there was a wiki page on the school that was edited about 8 days prior to the shooting, by someone with an IP address inside of, that community, inside of that area. But in 2000, the wiki page originally said, one of the pieces on there, anti-suicide programs are implemented to help lower chances of suicide and school shootings. Right? And so that was a piece that was on the wiki page for the school. Well, somebody went in and changed that and added the words, "Do they work? We shall see." Right? I don't know that, that it was noticed prior to the shooting by anybody. I do know that one of the parents of one of the seniors for the school had contacted the school at least 6 months before the shooting and really felt that like this school was just a hot box and a situation ready to explode for an active shooter type of event. There was a lot of bullying going on at the school. There were allegations of sexual assault that were happening at the school. Several students were suicidal. There are suicidal tendencies in different ways. And so there was at least concern among the parents enough to be able to reach out to the school. The school investigated it. They found that there was no evidence to substantiate the claim, of the parents. And they said, the school said they did their due diligence, didn't come up with anything. And obviously there's still challenges with this going back and forth, even, today in talking about the court system on the civil side. And that's why some people are working to try to get more information released about, about all of this. But that was probably the biggest sign, was the wiki edit. But again, I don't even know if that went noticed prior to the shooting. I do know that one of the really best friends of one of the younger shooters has, spoken online about how in hindsight, the signs were there, but at the time, for a teenager, it was just, what their norm was. And it wasn't anything that would have stuck out that this person stated there would have been any way to be able to prevent that on the front end. It just wasn't that obvious, but in hindsight, there were definitely signs that were there. Their plot. And so, I mentioned that the younger shooter was suicidal. The younger shooter had no intentions on living past the day of that shooting. And so their plot was, they're going to go into the room, they're going to shut the doors, they're going to kill everybody in that room. And then the older shooter was supposed to kill the younger shooter and basically put all the blame onto the younger shooter. Remember I said, the older one, he had a fantasy, wanted to get away with murder. And so this is all part of that plot. Whereas the younger shooter was going to take the blame, but the younger shooter was also supposed to be dead. And so it was supposed to be easier, to be able to pin on that. Well, there was other evidence at hand anyway. I think it would have come out. But, both shooters did ultimately didn't die that day. They both survived this encounter. And it didn't play out, according to what that original plan was. But they had an evil plot, that they were going to ultimately try and get away with it. They were able to obtain the guns from the house of the older shooter. The picture that looks more like an evidence photo, with that one, that was two of the guns that were used, one of them, each of them. But they also had, two of the other guns that, with them, and not these identical guns, but just something that matches, roughly this make and model to the gun, a Beretta 92 and a Ruger 1022 style rifle. But the guns that they use was a Glock caliber 45, model 21, and a 22 caliber Taurus tracker revolver. They ultimately, obtained the guns, from the older shooter's house. They had gone to the house ahead of time. They moved forward with filming a video of trying to stage the let's blame everything on the younger shooter. And so in the video, the younger shooter is yelling at the older one he's giving that person commands. The person seen snorting, which looks like snorting cocaine on video. And there's a gun safe in the video. And ultimately, they tried different ways to be able to get into it, tried to find the key, but eventually were able to pry it open, with a pry bar, with a crowbar, and were able to get it open. Well, the younger shooter that I found had zero evidence showed that the younger shooter had any knowledge or experience or training with firearms prior to this. But the younger shooter gave him, the knowledge, showed him how to load the guns. Both of them loaded the guns. They were unloaded in the gun safe, but both of them loaded the guns prior to leaving the house that day. I mentioned that one of them wrote on the wall that the voices win. One of them, I believe the older shooter, also spray painted his mom's car. I think put the number 666 on the mom's car. They lit it on fire with gasoline. It did end up, burning out, more than it ended up burning up the car and burning up the house. And so, a lot was happening. I assume the parents were obviously at work that day, but a lot was happening, at that home during the day. Well, they actually had started, their day at the school. So they started their day at the school, and then from there, went to the shooter's home. And then there was some, a lot of movement back and forth and whatnot that's outside of what we're going to get into today. But they did start their morning at school, left there, went to the house, and then ultimately they went back to the school to set up their stage story of how they were going to pin everything on the younger shooter. When they got to school, you can see here, one of them has a guitar case, one of them has a backpack. They had put guns in both the guitar case and the backpack to help conceal them going into school. Now, I mentioned that one of the entrances, it looks like it had a metal detector, and they were known to search the bags and that kind of stuff. And so very strategically, they chose the door that all they had to do was get buzzed in. They knew that they were not going to get checked. They knew that they were not going to get searched. This was going to be the easier door to be able to come in. Now, it may be that they're all forced through the same door at the beginning of school at that time. But again, this is kind of in the middle of the day. And so it may simply be that middle of the day, it's easier to get buzzed in here. But they come in, they just kind of give a wave, to whoever buzzed them in the door. And you can see them, here on the camera. Remember that killers plan. These attackers planned. Here in this case, they spent a month. They're going to talk about way more that we're going to have information on to be able to talk about in this webinar. But the key is that we have to understand that, these types of attackers, plan these types of situations. But they come into the classroom, or excuse me, they come into the hallway, and the image that you see on the left-hand side, they're actually fist bumping one another. Just sick individuals, they're fist bumping one another, they're hopping each other up to be able to go in and kill, other human beings. And then you can see in the right image that they separate. And so the classroom that they're going to, room 107, has two doors going into the room. Their intentions are each one of them go into one of the doors. And so after they hop each other up, fist bump one another, they head off in their own ways. Well, shooter one goes in the classroom and places the guitar case down, excuse me. puts the guitar case down, and then complained that he was feeling sick and asked for permission to go to the school nurse. And so he had already gone home sick that day, I believe, and that's why he was away from the school property that morning, so it probably fit in a little bit. But shooter number one, leaves and goes to the school nurse. Well, shooter number two had come in the other door, and the teacher asked, basically, more or less, not in necessarily a challenging way, but wondered why that student was there, because it wasn't his classroom, at least not at that time. And student number two said that he was there, he needed to speak with an individual in the classroom. Well, one of the individuals he wanted to speak with was really more of a ploy to get that person out of the room. Is that there were people in the room that they did not want to hurt, that they considered friends, that they cared for. And so, this is the only sign that we're going to see where there was any, empathy towards others in that, traditional sense. But the shooting doesn't happen right at that moment. And so eventually there's some text messages between the two, and they get their plan back together, and they end up heading back to the classroom. And when they come back into the classroom, the lights are dimmed, the TV's on, the kids are in there, and they were screening a movie. And so the kids are in there watching a movie. Well, shooter number one, comes back in the classroom, and again, it's dark, no one's really even paying attention. He shuts the door and slides the magnetic lock, fixing the door closed. That meant that someone wasn't going to be coming in or could not come in from the hallway side. And so they set up, the door to be more secure from the inside. So he prevents people from coming in to help, in this type of situation. Shooter number two, comes in the other door. And so now each one of them basically standing at the door. Shooter number one opens the guitar case and pulls out a handgun and yells, ultimately yells out, nobody move. And then shooter number two pulls a handgun out from a backpack. Well, immediately upon the first shooter pulling out the gun and yelling, nobody move, that's where hero Kendra Costello ends up, jumping up and immediately lunging towards the gunman, forcing him and pinning him against the wall. And during that encounter, he ultimately was shot in the chest and did succumb to his injuries, at least at a later point. But immediately, we had students in the classroom that jumped up to be able to stop that attacker. Well, as soon as the first gunshot goes off, shooter number two, starts shooting. And remember, he has targets in the room. And so I believe that she was shooting at, those targets in the room that were already identified prior on, the people that had teased her, that she had issues with. And so she has a revolver, I believe, that held 9 rounds. And so she fired all 9 rounds from that revolver at people, towards people, into people. And after, she runs out of ammo, she's just getting the clicks in the revolver. Well, at that point, somebody else lunged over the desk, tackled her, and I think she ended up back outside the classroom where I think the IT director was coming there and to investigate, and he was able to grab the gun from her. Well, she ends up, going back into the classroom to the backpack where she has it, to be able to reach in and grab the second firearm that was in the backpack that day. Well, at this point, she goes into the hallway and tries to shoot herself, but fails to know how to properly work the gun. It had a manual safety lever on it. The gun did not go off. She claimed that it was over not being able to know how to manipulate the safety, properly. But she's struggling with that. And not long after that is when the security guard approached her, with a firearm, and approached her, and ultimately was able to get her in handcuffs and take her into custody. Well, the other shooter number one, had already, run out of the room at that point, or excuse me, was being pinned down by others. And right, so I mentioned Kendrick Costello. Kendrick Costello, without hesitation, completely charged shooter number one. Immediately upon the shooter pulling the gun out, Kendrick Costello immediately jumps up and tackles the attacker. He did get shot, as I mentioned. Unfortunately, he did die in that incident. And two other students in there, Joshua Jones and Brendan Bailey, also tackled that attacker. So all three of them jumped up, without any concern of themselves to be able to to protect everybody inside of that room. Joshua Jones was shot 2 times in the leg during that encounter as well. And so they're able to hold him down, to pin him down, to get the firearm from him. Even Joshua, after being shot, multiple times in that situation. But they're able to completely gain control over him. And they were still pinning him down and holding him down, until law enforcement was able to get there and take over that situation. But there's no doubt, that the actions of these brave students saved lives that day. There's no doubt they are heroes, because they acted. And I think it's important that we highlight that. It's also important to talk about that Brendan, moved on in a career path of protection and ended up enlisted in the Marine Corps, after graduation of high school as well. And so there's no doubt these were heroes. Kendrick died, and he died saving other people as well. So it's horrible that he died, but because of their actions, it's also fantastic that nobody else was killed that day because of all three of them. There were definitely some lessons that are important to discuss. As I mentioned, in the last slide, the heroic actions saved lives that day. And when it's time to act, it's time to act. And, there's no doubt that with a lot of the situations that we look at, there are people who act. But then there's also going to be situations that require actions where people lack the knowledge or the plan or the guidance, of what to do into that type of situation. In this situation, right, running and hiding, was not an option. The shooting started from within the classroom without any warning. It wasn't like there were guns ablazing coming in. You didn't hear gunshots down the hall. There wasn't information that was being communicated over the loudspeaker about a shooter. It was the shootings happened. It started up right there in the classroom, feet away from the others. What does that mean? Well, that means that there's no time for running and hiding. This was a fight type of moment. You have to be prepared to act, if that time comes. And, too many times we don't put enough emphasis on the empowerment, in that fight type of situation. And yet with all of the shootings, or with many of the shootings, if somebody recognized the proper moments to be able to act out and use violence against the other attacker, or against the attacker, excuse me, then that may have been enough to stop the attack. The shooter ran out of ammunition with more people in the room. And what does that mean? That meant for a moment, the gun was no longer working, right? It could not hurt anybody at that moment. Now, the second shooter had a second gun, but it's going to take time to be able to deploy that firearm. That's a moment of opportunity. And someone recognized that in the classroom and tackled the shooter when that gun ran out of ammunition. That was a moment. And a lot of times it's people don't recognize these types of situations because they don't know enough about firearms to be able to understand how they operate, how they work. And this is actually something that we cover inside of our training program, where regardless of somebody's belief about guns, I want them to know enough knowledge about it to demystify them in such a way that if they're ever facing an attacker one day, they understand it enough to know when it's safe to do things like run away, when it's safe to do things, or safer to do things like, grab a hold of the gun or tackle the attacker, and those kinds of situations. So just having enough information to be able to recognize these different types of situations, such as when the gun ran out of ammunition. The Gabby Gifford shooting, that's another one I can remember where the attacker went to reload and someone very quickly grabbed the second magazine from the attacker and prevented that person from being able to reload the gun and harm other people. While the shooter number 2 was trying to take her own life at the time, that person also struggled with the handgun safety. Now, I mentioned this person didn't have a lot of experience leading up to it, a lot of knowledge on guns, but trying to shoot herself and struggle with the handgun safety. This kind of goes back to knowing enough about firearms to recognize those opportunities to know when it is time to act in that situation. I think that the STEM shooting from 2019 also shows how important it is to empower staff and volunteers. Planning to wait for law enforcement to get there or for school resource officers to solve the problem, ultimately that plan's set up for failure in that sense, right? Because time matters, is that we don't want to have to wait for somebody to come protect us if they're not there to protect us in the moment, and that situation doesn't dictate hide. That situation dictates it's time to do something like get away, or it's time to do something like, be violent towards the attacker. The police response time doesn't get much better than this situation. They were able to respond within 2 minutes of that initial call that went out. So 2 minutes, that's a faster response time that they were able to get there. But obviously, that was just getting to the scene. That was after the communication went out. The shooting was already taking place, and both the attackers were already subdued by the time law enforcement was at the attacked location. And it's the people that are in that room that are, being forced to be the first responders, right? And so I think that it's very important that we should have the layers of security. And as I mentioned, the school did well, with putting lots of pieces in place to be better prepared for that situation. But at the end of the day, sometimes the answer is action, is fighting, is responding with force or violence to be able to make that attacker stop. And they did very well with preventing that attacker from being able to move forward to hurt other people, this day. Chaos. I didn't talk about this in this situation, but there, with every active shooting that I ever have looked at, reading the witness reports, reading the official reports, reading the probable cause statements, with all of it, news stories, doesn't matter what you look at, there's a tremendous amount of unpredictability and chaos in these types of situations. That has to be expected. One of the pieces that, came out in this one was the security guard. Now, I remember he came from the law enforcement side. He came from military background with, deployments into Afghanistan. And he's someone that had the training, in these types of situations. But it was so chaotic and so threatening that the security guard actually mistaked law enforcement in this situation as the attacker. And so he saw the muzzle coming from around the corner of one of the law enforcement officers' gun and immediately started shooting. Remember, he was a unarmed security guard, but he was carrying a firearm that day. But he shot towards the police officers. Did not hit the police officers, but one of his bullets did go through the wall and end up injuring a female student that day. Thankfully, she survived that attack. And it's that kind of chaos, is that, it's with all of his training, he still acted on assumptions based on what was seen. And again, I don't want to, try to sit there and talk about like, here's what he did wrong. Let's figure out in the future, how can we do things better, right? What lessons can we learn from this? And that's, we've got to build the expected chaos and expected unpredictability into our plans, into our actions on everything that we're doing with it. And that applies not just in an active shooter situation, but that applies to, to home defense, to personal protection, to any of that kind of stuff. Chaos has to be very expected, because it ultimately is a piece. It is there. It's been there with every single one of them, that I have ultimately looked at. As we go through these events, if you have questions, as I mentioned, be sure to drop those down into the Q&A box. Let's see. I did see that one of the questions that's come up is, unfortunately, somebody has struggled maybe to see my video coming through, is able to hear the voice. If that's the case with everyone, I'm pretty positive, at least I do have a recording of this, and I'll make sure that we get the higher quality video out to everyone later today. But today's lessons is really, it's more about empowerment more than anything. People want to act. People need to act, and really people sometimes they need permission to act. They need that empowerment. And there's no doubt that training makes people better prepared to act in these types of situations. Many times the plan of a school is the school resource officer or its local law enforcement nearby. Or even for churches, a lot of times it's, well, we've got this off-duty police officer that's typically there on a Sunday, or this other officer is also usually there, right? It's those kinds of pieces. Well, ultimately, it's the people who are in that encounter that are the ones that are, forced into these situations to be able to, be forced to act. It's the people who were there at that time. And, it doesn't matter how fast law enforcement can get there or that school resource officer to get there. They're highly likely not going to be in that attack location. Why? Well, because the shooter intentionally is going to choose locations that aren't where there's an armed police officer, an armed security guard that's standing there. I've mentioned this in the past, but the active shooters, they've got a goal. What is that goal? They typically have the intention on killing. Most of the time, they want to kill, the most amount of people that they can. They want to drive up that body count. Well, so they're by default, they're going to choose the locations that are going to be less susceptible to someone, stopping them. They're looking for the easier victims. And so, it's very important that, we are empowering those people. And I mentioned it, that they want it. I've had plenty of conversations with plenty of people that a lot of times they feel left out, because they're not getting the training that they believe is necessary to be able to keep their school safer, or to keep their church safer. And so I think it's important that we have, these types of conversations. But a lot of times the situations are over long before law enforcement is able to respond. Obviously, we would love to partner, with you on this. Our program is available, risk-free to test drive, for your organization, meaning that we do have a money-back guarantee if your staff or your community does not find our training program valuable. That's how much we believe in that. But we definitely do believe in the empowerment, of people. I think that that's where, in the short term, that's how we fix these situations, or how to make the outcomes much better, is to be better prepared to prevent them and to be better prepared to respond to them. And a lot of times we fall very, short of this with all kinds of different entities. But if you'd like to know more about our program, don't hesitate to reach out. I've got my contact information up on the screen. Also, for certain types of organizations, we have the ability to be able to custom tailor our video lessons to be able to fit any specific needs or policies that you potentially have. And with all of our partners, we're there to be able to create new content to fill gaps as needed. Being that if you've got something that is a gap for your entity that you need more information on when it comes to safety, security, or responding, to violence, we're there to be able to create new content to get that information out in a fast, intuitive manner through our e-learning dashboard. But thanks for taking the time to watch this material today. If you didn't catch it last month, I had a webinar on the 2022 data that was found from the active shooter report that the FBI puts out. A lot of great information in there. Be sure to watch that. And next month on November 7th, which is a Wednesday, 10 a.m. Central, 11 a.m. Eastern, we will pick back up with our next lesson learned series. And that will likely be the final one until the end of the year, so until January. So be sure to jump on that one. I'll send out an email and send out that registration information. As with all of our Lessons Learned series, you can find them now listed on our YouTube channel that is under YouTube, the @ symbol, and together the words Defender School. We've got all of those listed on there. Thanks for taking the time to watch the material, and I hope to see you back next month for our Lessons Learned series.